Welcome to the Blending Worlds podcast, where identity and psychology meet across cultures. Tune into a new podcast every week. Welcome back to the Blending Worlds podcast. My name is Rese and I'm your host. Thank you to each and every person that is tuning into this podcast. I hope you had an amazing week, and if not, I hope that your week gets better. So today's podcast is actually going to be a really interesting podcast because I'm actually starting a new series called Returning Home. Now, when I first thought of this concept or got inspired with this concept, there were a few different directions that I wanted to take it. So initially, I was actually thinking about my experience going back to Jamaica, which, if you guys don't know, I was actually born on the beautiful Caribbean island, Jamaica, which I discussed in one of my earlier podcasts. So if you haven't listened to it yet, please go back and check it out. It was actually a pretty good podcast. But I was thinking about that and kind of like the reverse culture shocks, I should say, after living in the US for a vast majority of my life. But then I also thought about my college experience, and I thought about a conversation that I had with someone, which I'll reference in this podcast a little later in this podcast. But I definitely wanted to do this because I thought this was a podcast that not just first gens, because I know I was kind of touching on first gens in my most recent podcast, but this is something that I feel like everyone can relate to a certain degree, and it's something that I've definitely had a lot of conversations with people about, and I can tell that it's a topic that so many people can relate to. So today's podcast title in its entirety is Returning Home When Home No Longer Feels Like Home. So like I mentioned, today's podcast is actually going to be me detailing my college experience and navigating transition and how home kind of changed after going off to college. So I actually want to start off with a conversation I actually had with a spiritual mentor right before I came off to college my freshman year. So I remember right before I was leaving for college, and my spiritual mentor, I was having a conversation with him. At the time, he was my spiritual mentor, I should say. But I was having a conversation with him, and I remember we were talking about college, and I remember he looked at me and he was like, "You don't really seem that excited." And I actually remember having a follow-up conversation with someone else, and I was saying to them, it's kind of crazy how everyone always talks about starting a new season and how exciting it is, but no one ever talks about how hard it is to let go of an old one. And I remember, in a way, it was I was grieving my childhood. I was grieving understanding that, because I was young when I came off to college, so I was not a legal adult yet. But at the same time, I was definitely realizing that I'm perceived as an adult now. Going off to college, that's a huge step. I'm no longer a child. I'm going off to this new world, this completely different world that I had never probably experienced before. I was worried about whether I would make friends. I was worried about whether I would fit in. I was worried about so many different factors. But I will say, though transition is hard, it is necessary. And this was definitely something that I experienced throughout my college career. I outgrew certain spaces, I outgrew certain relationships, and I even outgrew certain roles that I played in others' lives. And like I was mentioning before, within my college experience, I had to learn how to navigate all of that. And I remember actually having a conversation with someone right after I just came back from my first semester of college. So I started summer semester, so I basically got a head start from a lot of my peers. I was able to come on campus when there wasn't a ton of students on campus, meet people, get involved a bit. I stayed in the same dorm. I remember my freshman year, so I was able to meet a lot of the girls on my dorm floor and start to bond with people and have conversations with people. But I remember having a conversation with someone when I came back from college, and they asked me, like, how does it feel to be home? And I'll never forget my response was like, like after going off to college and coming back, like home no longer feels like home. And it was a really weird thing because I actually remember having a conversation with someone on my dorm floor, and they were saying the same exact thing. They were like, yeah, like home isn't really home anymore, but also like our dorms are also not home. And it's kind of interesting because I feel like that's definitely a part of transition, like realizing that you're outgrowing certain spaces, and certain spaces that you used to fit into, you no longer fit into. And it was interesting going back home because I feel like, in a way, everything kind of reminded me of my past self. Like everything, and I know like summer semester is only a few weeks. So this is actually kind of like a crazy thing to say. But I do remember, like, to me, there was like a clear, distinct difference with who I was before I left versus who I was when I went back. And it wasn't just navigating being in a new environment, but it was also like growing as a person, growing as an individual, learning what my values were, learning what my morals were, having to navigate like what are my hobbies, like who am I as a person, what kind of person do I want to be, my religious beliefs. Like there were so many different factors that changed within not just like the 6 to 8 weeks of my freshman summer, but also I remember my freshman year, there was like a huge distinct difference between who I was when I got dropped off freshman summer versus who I was when I went back home after the summer. Certain things that I used to do before I didn't do. I picked up new hobbies. I'm sure even some of my mannerisms were different, and that is such a transformative experience, and it's something that I know that so many people definitely can relate to. And the thing is, I will say, like, everyone talks about how college is the best 4 years of your life, but no one talks about how hard that transition from childhood to adulthood is. Because it's like, even though I was having all these amazing experiences, I was learning about myself, I was growing, I was even like, like picking up new hobbies, like I mentioned. I was learning so much more about the kind of person that I wanted to be and kind of shedding that old skin. But at the same time, that transition was hard because no one talks about how, in a way, you really are shedding off your old self in order to grow into your new one. So it was definitely a very transformative experience, but it was also really hard and really difficult. I remember someone telling me this right before I came off to college. They were like, when you go to college, like, it's not just, going to parties or going out with friends and studying and what society showcases as the college experience. But I remember having someone tell me, like, you're going to be alone with your own thoughts. And are you ready for that? Are you ready for having to look back upon your life and self-reflect in a way that you probably never had to when you were in that environment? But being outside of it, having to self-reflect and realize this and realize that. And as you grow and you learn all these different things about yourself, you're not just learning the beautiful things, you're also learning the bad parts of yourself. And that was something that I definitely experienced, I would say, throughout my college experience. I learned that there were parts of myself that I wanted to change. I wanted to do better and become better, but first I had to confront those parts of myself. I also had to confront like my upbringing, thinking about my childhood, like deeply thinking about things and self-reflecting on things that I'd never self-reflected on before when I was in that environment. And the truth is, that is a part of the transformative process. You have to go through that process. You have to shed parts of yourself to develop your new self, to grow into your new self. And you have to let go of your past self in order to become your new self. And a part of that process was outgrowing people that I knew for so long, and even outgrowing certain roles that I played in people's lives. I had this conversation with someone, I believe my sophomore year. No one talks about how your family dynamics changes after you go to college. Your family, in a way, still sees you as a baby. They still see you as a child. They still see you as this little teenager that's still making irrational decisions. But they don't see that you're developing, that you're becoming a new person, that you're starting to have your own values, your own goals, your own dreams from your life. And when you combine that with like those familial expectations, that transition season becomes so much more overwhelming, so much more difficult. Combined with the fact that that transition is also combined with academic pressures as well as navigating social life in college. This definitely explains the fact that studies show that 45% of college students actually struggle with their mental health. Like I mentioned before, while you are going through that transition season, you're also having to confront so many things that you probably never had to do as a teenager. And for some people, coming to college and not having those rigid rules that you did have within your teenage years in high school, not having other people to make those boundaries for you, having all that freedom that college entails actually becomes really difficult, because you have to teach yourself discipline. You have to teach yourself boundaries. You have to say like, hey, this is what my morals are. I'm not just going to do this because people are doing this. I'm not just going to do that because people are doing this. And I personally saw a lot of people come to college and struggle with that, because it's like you have all this freedom, you want to use it, but with freedom has to come discretion. And so many people struggle with that. There's so much going on throughout college and throughout navigating adulthood. So it's no surprise that so many people do struggle with their mental health. But like I mentioned before, if you are one of those people, please seek therapy. I 100% recommend talking to someone, talking to a counselor, or even talking to someone that you just trust. Just know that you're not alone while you are experiencing transition. And if you are experiencing struggles with your mental health, you're definitely not alone, and people care. I do want to end this podcast by giving some advice to anyone that's currently experiencing transition. Give yourself the space to grow. I know this is so much easier said than done as a college student, and if you're someone that's a perfectionist, this is even so much harder, but give yourself the space to grow. What I really love about like butterflies, like we see the transformative process of how butterflies go from caterpillars and how they become beautiful and they get to fly and travel the world. But it was a process, and they had to go through that process before they could turn into something beautiful, before they could fly their wings. And I think that's something that is so important for everyone out there that's experiencing a season of transition. Give yourself the space to grow. I would also say, recognize that a part of transition is shedding a part of yourself while growing into another part of yourself. Like I mentioned before, it can be so hard because there's always so much emphasis on transition, on how exciting this new season is and getting to experience new things, but no one talks about mourning your past self and shedding your old skin. And this is actually a process in psychology known as transitional mourning, and it's 100% normal, like experiencing those emotions of sadness, of realizing that you're no longer in that past season and you're no longer that old version of yourself is normal. You're not alone. Before I go, I want to say this to anyone in transition between worlds, between seasons, between versions of yourself: breathe. You're not lost, you're just becoming. That's it for today's podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. I really hope that you guys continue to join me as I go through this series called Returning Home. If you guys haven't checked out my past few podcasts, please do. I definitely am so grateful for any form of support. And if you would like to share this podcast with someone that you think needs to hear this, please do. And you can also tag this podcast on both Instagram as well as TikTok. And I will see you guys next week. Bye!